So when I looked at Dietrich's presentation, what he had done was he was really looking at church planting strategies for a region or a city as if it were a single denomination or a single group that were doing that. And as I looked at it, I thought to myself, well, the only piece that's missing here is those occasions when churches come together across denominations to look at a strategy for a city. So I'm going to just touch on that one aspect of working together, okay? And today, certainly in England, I know that there are many, many examples of situations where churches are coming together across denominational boundaries with the formation of a strategy. For example, in my own city of Birmingham, there's a movement which is actually pioneered really by Andy's denomination, FIEC. You may not know this, I don't know, do you? 2020.
Yeah.
Which was a fairly modest idea to just plant 20 gospel churches in a city, a huge city, by the year 20. So that was a modest vision. But interestingly, as they've brought together lots of people from across the denominations, actually they've easily gone past that 20, and who knows what the final figure will be. There's another group which has a vision it's called From the Humber to the Wash, and if you know England at all, you'll know that on the right hand side there's a big bit that sticks out, and we call that East Anglia, and that is encompassed by two estuaries. One is called the Humber, one is called the Wash. So from the Humber to the Wash. And their goal is very ambitious. They want a gospel witness in every community in that area. And that's fantastically ambitious because their communities in that area are normally quite small villages. So a gospel witness, that might be a church, it might be a house group related to a church in a nearby town, but the point is it's a cooperative vision. There's another one for the whole of Merseyside called Together for the Harvest. And I could keep going. It's a phenomenon at the moment that there are unity movements all over the country which are looking at mission evangelism and sometimes church planting as an outcome of their unity. Sometimes there are whole nation movements, and you're probably aware of them in France. There's one which is bringing together the denominations to do church planting under the heading One for 10,000, one church for 10,000 French people, un pour 10,000. And that's an amazing project, and it's causing there to be a much greater growth in evangelism outreach and also church planting. So bearing in mind that that's the reality, what are the things that specifically can be managed by these sorts of unity movements? So I've just tried to observe what happens when people typically are working with others. And the first thing, obviously, is that nothing happens until people build relationships. Sometimes that building of relationships happens over a very long period of time. Interestingly, in many places, it's not the large churches, but the smaller churches that come and build relationships, and sometimes it's the larger churches that come on board last. Not always, but the fundamental point is that there are trusted relationships. People are friends before they are strategists. They learn to like each other before they learn to plan with each other. And that's absolutely fundamental to the whole process. Secondly, of course, out of those friendships, there needs to be a testing period to see, do we agree on what our vision might be? And it may be that you built excellent relationships, but actually you can't agree on a vision, in which case that's as far as it goes. But at least there's good relationships. But more often than not, what happens is that you do begin to agree what a vision could look like for a given town, city, region, maybe even nation. Now, it's one thing to agree a vision, it's another thing to cast a vision. And usually what happens is that leaders will use an event. And often it takes quite a bit of time to plan a really good event. But an event is wonderful in terms of casting the vision, because what often happens is that people are sometimes surprised by their own strength. We sometimes have a tendency to look at ourselves and think, well, we're just weak. But when we start to cast vision, it's amazing how just the act of casting vision draws in numbers of people that we just hadn't even imagined were there. And I've noticed again and again and again how groups who were casting vision, they thought they might get 50 people, maybe even 100, are sometimes just overwhelmed and overjoyed because they find that they're actually speaking to far more people than they'd originally thought. So the process of casting the vision is also part of the whole process that results in planters being recruited. Just casting the vision helps to recruit planters. Now that's not the only thing that recruits planters, and some of the other elements in recruiting planters is that you begin to be aware of others who can help you. So there might be other agencies. For example, there are a number of agencies which are not supposed to be doing church planting, but they are. For example, Youth of the Mission. I won't name the other list because it's sometimes a bit sensitive, but there are a number of agencies which are in fact church planting, which become resources. And even if they can't church plant directly because of the restrictions that they have on their policy, at least they can help you find planters, which is great. And then, of course, the existing churches in the network, once a vision is cast, it's surprising how some who would perhaps not have thought of going into any kind of ministry of a traditional nature, the very idea of church planting gets them excited about ministry. So they might not have thought of themselves as a minister, but they might think of themselves as a church planter. So actually, there may be more resources in the existing churches than you might imagine. Prayer has a way of turning up people that we just never expected to arrive. And it's just amazing how many times when groups of churches begin to pray, they think their resources are completely inadequate, resources seem to turn up. It's just fantastic. Now, wherever we get our resources from, whether it's other agencies, whether it's our existing networks, whether it's just the divine intervention that comes through prayer, it is important that we put in place some assessment processes. In other words, not everybody that volunteers for church planting is necessarily the right person for the job. Now, there are lots of assessment processes available. There's a really good one in the UK that's run by a group called Momentum, and that's available to anybody to send people on. It consists of a whole weekend of conversation, tests, interviews, and also the presence of a Christian psychologist, which is helpful, actually. It's surprising how church planting seems to attract those who are unstable in certain ways, shall we say. Let's not take it any further than that, but you know what I mean. Obviously, that doesn't apply to any of you in this room. But it's surprising, actually, because people think that this is an opportunity for them to have a platform that they wouldn't get in any other way. So we just have to be a bit cautious when we're recruiting people and put them through an assessment process. Now, the best assessment processes, in my view, are not pass, fail, but rather they're ones that say, here are your strengths, here are things you might need to work on, and here are some areas of concern, possibly, that you really do need to address before you take the process any further forward. So in other words, you're not ever saying to somebody, God can never use you, but you are saying, let's be realistic about the things that still need to be addressed. The other thing that churches working together can do is research. What is the situation? And research is the obvious thing, what churches already exist. So track the existing churches. And what normally happens, it's fascinating actually, there are a huge number of churches being planted in many, many countries at the moment, and many of them are under the radar. In other words, nobody knew about them. And you often don't find out about them until you go looking for them. I've got a friend who's planting a church in a part of Birmingham, And before he started the planting exercise, he just went around the neighborhood to find out what was already there. And he's discovered 10 churches that have been planted recently that are not on anybody's list. They just happened, that's it. But it's good to know about them. He's still going to be planting, but it's good to know about what's there already and to see what they're doing and to see where the other churches that are being planned might fit so that they don't hamper each other's work. Seeing what exists helps us to see what's needed. You've probably all had a pack of cards from Andy with needing neighbourhoods in Britain. I think that's a fantastic piece of kit. Wish I'd thought of it, but I'm glad you did the work. That's great. It's excellent. And yeah, I mean, that's what we need to know, isn't it? We need to know where are the most needy areas so that we can begin to recruit people. The other thing that we can do is community profiling. Now, there's not a lot of time to talk about this in this session, but there's somebody in the UK who's actually a professor at one of the universities who's developing a model for community profiling. In other words, taking a look at what are the themes and what's going on in a given community, so that when we're planting into that community, we're doing so with our eyes wide open. Now, I don't have details of that to hand, but if anybody's interested in getting details, I'd be happy to feed those to you at a later time. Sometimes, though not always, it's possible for churches that are working together to think about the training process, and there's all kinds of training schemes available, which you're probably aware of. Oyvind, of course, has been pioneering something called M4, but there's also Forge, which is something that's come from originally Australia, from Alan Hirsch, and there's lots of other programs available. They all basically are covering much the same territory, and the first thing that they're hitting is church planting generally works better out of team. So how do you build team? How do you recruit? And how do you work within a team context? Secondly, those who are church planting need to be culturally aware. How do you help people become aware of the culture that they're seeking to reach? That's quite a key issue, which we don't need to go into at the moment, but just helping people to know how to be aware of the cultural issues that they're going to meet is important. And that's particularly important when you're doing cross-cultural evangelism, because one of the big issues that we're facing in the UK right now that you may be aware of is that we have thousands, and it is thousands, of African churches, also Asian and South American churches. And of course the goal of every African leader is to reach white Anglo-Saxons. But of course they don't. And there are very good reasons why they don't, and it's mostly because they have got no training in cross-cultural sensitivity. So teaching elderly women to dance probably isn't going to be the main way of getting church growth in England, but you'll be surprised how many African leaders think it is. It's just a huge problem, and it's an urgent problem because, as African leaders will tell you, they're not keeping their children and their grandchildren, whereas their children and grandchildren actually are probably going to be more effective church planters than they are in terms of the indigenous population. So working with all of these cultural issues is a big thing. Obviously we need to teach people what the planting processes are. How do you just go about it? How do you gather a group? How do you know when you launch? What's the sensitivity around that? What's an appropriate size group? All of those kinds of things. These are simple things to teach. But it's surprising how many people have planted churches without knowing these things and had to learn the hard way, me included. I think the best training is training on the job. In other words, action, reflection, learning. You learn something, you try it, you reflect on what happened, you learn some more, action, reflection. It's very, very effective. And actually, it's cost effective as well, because you're getting on with the job, you're earning your keep, if you like, while you're training. So it's a great way of doing it. And then lastly, and then Dietrich, this is teeing you up, it's important to build into your systems, and again, churches can do this across the board, a coaching and mentoring pattern. There's a difference between coaching and mentoring, and usually people who are good coaches are not good mentors, and people who are good mentors are not always good coaches. My definition, there's lots of different definitions, but my definition is that coaches are asking the question, how's the task going? Mentors are asking the question, how are you going? It's a big difference, isn't it? And very often you'll find that coaches will be so consumed with the task that when they come in, they say, well, how's the task going? Well, actually, my marriage is in some difficulty at the moment. Oh, really? Oh, that's unfortunate. Yeah, but how's the task going? It's a completely different kind of person that you need. And so often you need to be thinking about two separate tracks. One, somebody's going to do coaching, somebody's going to do mentoring. Sensitive issue. But again, the same things apply. Those who are doing coaching and those who are doing mentoring need to be aware of the team dynamics. They need to be asking questions about how effective is the connection with the culture, how have they understood the planting processes, and what training are they getting on the job. Coaches and mentors can keep people on track in terms of the follow-up from the training. Okay, well that's just a very, very quick overview of things that can maybe be done across denominations rather than just within a denomination. But Dietrich's got some extremely good material on how single denominations can push forward a strategy for a region. Is there a preference between going down the route of working across denominations or working within a single one? I actually think that you need both. I know it's a bit of a get out, but I actually do think you need both, because the point about working in a single denomination is that it actually focuses the effort in a way that it's difficult to do across denominations. So that's the strength of that. The strength of working across denominations locally is that it opens up resources that it's difficult to open up as a single denomination. For example, in the UK right now, there are many, many city authorities that would like to have voluntary agencies, which is how they think of churches, take over their buildings, their services, services towards youth or whatever it might be. But they don't know who to talk to. If you put yourself in the shoes of a secular local authority, city council, who would they talk to? Well, if the churches have got their act together and they're operating as a single unit in a city, it's easy to know who to talk to, and they're much more inclined to make resources available in that kind of way across the board than they are to a single denomination. So there's advantages that are quite different. So I think you just need the weave of both in given situations. That would be my take on it.
I'd like to follow up on mentoring and coaching, but because I just saw this wonderful illustration of it up here. The difference between mentoring and coaching is very easy to understand. Do you know that the term mentoring comes from Homer's work, Ulysses? Ulysses was going off to war. He knew he would be away from home for 10 years. He had a small boy, and he knew that he would not be there for the development of his son into manhood. And so he left the development of his son's education and character forming into the hands of his slave, and his name was mentor. So what does a mentor do? If this is the mentor, he takes what he knows and he pours it into the mentee. It's the educational system that we have, basically. It's content-based education or training. Coaching is very different. Coaching is taking what is in the coachee and pouring it out. The coachee probably doesn't even know what's inside of him, but a good coach will take what is inside of him and pour it out for the coachee to see. So that is a big difference. And a good coach will also identify not just the ministry areas, but the personal areas in which there are challenges to address. So in my book, The Jesus Model, I give you my coaching model, which is very simple to use. The best models are simple, refers to the past of that person, the present challenge, and in the future, and is always outcome-based, results-oriented. If a coaching or even a mentoring session does not lead to good results, it's a poor session. And in terms of coaching, the coach never does the work of the coachee, but always leads the coachee to his own conclusions and to making his own goals as well. Discipleship is depending on what context you put discipleship. You can have the one-on-one discipleship, and that would be a combination of coaching and mentoring. Coaching surfaces the issues with the help of the Holy Spirit that need to be addressed. Okay, the way that we train people is in a linear fashion. It's the Greek method of education. So you go into the introductory course, then you go into the intermediate course and the advanced level, and we do it in a linear fashion. The Holy Spirit doesn't do it that way. He brings us into greater Christ-likeness in terms of a mosaic stone method. Mosaic stones. He may address an issue of my sexuality, but next week it may be something about my spirituality, or an anger issue, or love, or learning to serve. And you can only surface that by being a good coach, which is being a good listener and asking the right questions. And then after you know the issues that need to be addressed by the Holy Spirit, you can begin to mentor and give information, which is always best paired with homework assignments. The person that you're discipling needs to do things that are pertinent to the discipling process. Discipleship has to do with three areas: character building, knowledge base, and skills. The easiest thing to teach a person is knowledge, biblical knowledge, and skills. The more difficult thing is character, of course. So these are a few things about just banking on the good things that Martin has said to keep in mind. And I have, in terms of the church planting process, in my book I have a checklist for the 4 phases that we use in Germany to go for the coach to have in front of him, to make sure that these areas have been talked through, and have been reached in terms of readiness to go to the next phase. You need to know when you can lead your church planter to the next phase, and you need to have some sort of a template to do that, and that's written in the book there. Now, when we look at church planting, especially in the book of Acts, and we look at Paul in the way that he refers to church planting, we find something very interesting. Half of the times in which Paul talks about church planting, he does not talk about a specific church planting location like a town, city, or village. 50% of the time in which he speaks about church planting, he speaks about regions or even countries in terms of church planting. There's a big difference between the two of these. You can have the aptitude to plant a church in a city or a village or a town, and not have the aptitude be part of a church planting movement that would reach a region or a significant section of your country or populace. Half of the times in which Paul refers to church planting, he's referring to regional church planting. So the churches in Asia Minor, the churches in Macedonia, the churches in Greece. And it's a different ballgame when you think regionally, and when you have a leader who has the aptitude. I would call him an apostolic church planting leader, somebody who has the giftedness, the maturity, the knowledge of helping to generate and sustain a church planting movement in an area of the country. So that's what we would like to continue to talk about today. How can we reach a region or even greater parts of the city? Craig Ott, one of my mentors, church planter in Germany and church planting leader in the Evangelical Free Church in America, and Gene Wilson have written a wonderful book in terms of the global perspective on church planting called Global Church Planting. I would very much commend that to you. And they talk about different regional strategies for church planting in this book. They talk about harvest priority church planting, which means that you begin by doing lots and lots of evangelism. You want to do not just one method, but many, many methods in order to stir up many new converts through which you then plant new churches. It is what I would call conversion-based church planting. It is the biblical model. I call it the Lydia model. When Paul went to Europe, his beachhead was Lydia, and her associates, her oikos, and they became the genesis of the newly planted church. As I said, the way that we plant churches today in Europe, by and large, is gathering Christians. We get them to adopt a certain DNA, or we lead them through a process of discovering their DNA, their profile, their ministry profile. And it's only after a year and a half, 2 years, when they really actually begin to become effective in terms of evangelism and church and disciple making. I think that this is sort of a misconstrued way of doing it. It's not the way of the Holy Spirit. We don't organize churches. We want to see the Holy Spirit organically raise up people from the harvest for the harvest in church planting. So we need to get back to that. And one strategy is you start with doing lots of evangelism. You could do event-oriented evangelism, personal evangelism, small group evangelism, and you do try a lot of things, and you find out what works. Success in ministry is finding out what God blesses and doing more of it. It's very simple. But in order to get to success, you need to try lots of things. So you're going to be a friend of experimentation. And you're going to try a lot of new things in order to see where's the harvest. And can we then shepherd the harvest into new churches? Then the second way that Ott and Wilson talk about church planting regionally is strategic beachhead church planting. You think about Omaha Beach, the Allied forces coming to France in order to not invade France, but to retake it from the Nazis. They needed a beachhead. They needed to start somewhere. And so if you're thinking of a region, think strategically, prayerfully about where would you start in this region? Where would be your beachhead? Where would you establish a presence from which would extend then a gospel influence or church planting influence? So if you're thinking about the region of, in the UK, Wales, where there's not a lot of church planting, where would you start in Wales? And how would that extend into the rest of the country? Is Wales a country? Okay. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is, you will probably say, he is, well, was Jonah not swallowed by a whale? No. This is guilt by association. And then there is, they would say, strategic beachhead church planting, where would you, in order to reach an entire region, begin? And how would you do that? And then cluster church planting, which is something that we'll go on to talk more about. But how would you use more church plants and then draw them together for a more potent presence of the kingdom of God in that region? Sometimes church plants are often, at the beginning at least, very small, and they do not realize what potential they could have in a region if they weren't brought together with others. And it is the bringing together of other church plants to form clusters. Think about the house church movement. Very little in the house church movement, it convinces me that it is a viable movement in Europe. We come from a Christendom model where you need some sort of physical presence like a building in order to give your movement credibility. And a house church model, at least in Germany, doesn't go over very well with Germans. They say that cannot be a church. This cannot be taken seriously. And then they're very fragile. They're here today, gone tomorrow. And they're not, there's not, despite the literature, simple church is not that simple. Once you get into it, it's very complicated. It sounds simple, but it's not that simple. But what happens is that people in small church plants, be it house churches, have a ghetto mentality, where it's just a small group of us in this big region, and we're all alone, and we get frustrated and we get depressed sometimes. But if you were to cluster these people, a number of maybe 5 or 10 house churches into one event, into one gathering, all of a sudden people get encouraged. They say, wow, I never knew you were over there or you're over here. I never knew that God had such a presence in our region, in our area. And of course, that gives non-Christians as well the gift of anonymity. In a small church plant under 70 people, what the non-Christian does not have is the gift of being anonymous. In a house church, you can't hide in a house church. You can't hide in a small church. And what the non-Christian needs, if he's seeking out Christianity, is a group that is big enough in which he can hide. Don't touch me, don't talk to me, let me explore. But in a small church, everybody wants to get to you and find out, you are the lemon, and they want to squeeze you and find out what you're made of. And if you're just a seeker, you're saying, this is too intense. I can't take this. This is scaring me off. But if you were to do cluster planting, you would give non-Christians the gift of being anonymous, invisible, that you can't in a small cluster, in a small entity. Then they talk about the spreading vine church planting methodology, whereas a vine naturally spreads itself around, or a strawberry plant in my garden is spreading around. So where is a church naturally developing? Where are regions in the region where the presence of God and the people of God is going and growing? And can we generate new churches out of these organically grown places where the people of God are going? And then they talk about the dandelion or the spontaneous or diaspora church planting. So where have Christians gone to, like a dandelion seed? They've been blown away from an existing plant or church, and they have landed somewhere. And that Christian is a potential missionary or church planter or disciple maker, all three perhaps. And where is he generating by his presence a new Christian entity or maybe even a new church? So training people to be disciple makers and church planters wherever God sends them is part of this thinking. My wife and I and a small team of people will be planting a church in Frankfurt next year, starting to plant a church, an English-speaking German evangelical free church in Frankfurt, among the up and outers, among the people in the financial section. 25% of people who live in Frankfurt have something to do with finances. Now, I have very little to do with finances. I'm glad that my wife gives me my allowance, and I've been hounding her for years to have a raise in my allowance, but she is very stubborn. So I thought, let's start a church among people who have the resources that I could maybe profit from, because my wife is not giving me what I need, I think, to buy more books and drink more coffee. So, but anyway, it's a very strategic place. Martin Luther, his namesake, said Frankfurt is the gold and silver hole of Germany. 500 years ago, it was the gold and silver hole of Germany. And it is the second leading financial capital of Europe, next to London. And European Central Bank is there, and 450 international banks are there. But I am of the opinion that people in this network, we would call them, they're professionals on an upward incline. They want to be career people, and they will probably only have about 3 years of their time spent in Frankfurt, and then they will be sent out by the bank or their financial institution to Hong Kong, to Budapest, to New York, to London. So we will have a 3-year window with most people in order to train them to be disciple makers. And we will send them off, and each one will have the commission to be a disciple maker and possibly to be a church planter. And maybe the Lord will send them back. So these are some of the strategies that Ott and Wilson talk about in terms of regional church planting. Now what about multiple church plants at one time in one given locale, whether it be a region or a city? Well, let me talk about how you could do that. This is one possibility. Divide the region or the city in which you're living in or want to enter into thirds. Take out a map and divide it into thirds. 3 pieces of the pie. It's a big pie. Find out where are the existing churches in these areas, and then find out how healthy are these existing churches. We used to, in Germany, for years, one of our excuses for not planting churches in a given city or location was we asked ourselves the question, is there a Baptist church there already? Well, if there was a Baptist church, that was our reason for not planting an evangelical free church. We thought, well, Baptist presence, that's enough. Well,
I'm into that.
What's that? I'm into that. Well, we have found out that not every Baptist church is a healthy Baptist church. In Germany. In the UK, I know it's different, or in Scotland, or in Wales, or in Ireland. But in Germany, not every Baptist church is a healthy Baptist church. And so you don't necessarily want to be satisfied with what are the churches there in the sections, the thirds that you're looking at, but how healthy are they? Are they growing through conversion growth? And oftentimes as a church planter, before I started, I would go incognito to the places that were in my sphere of church plant and would visit these churches, and I would be able to read a fellowship, and I could tell you whether this was a growing church or not. There are many ways. Look at the walls, the floor, the inventory. If it's old, if it's needing repair, painting, new chairs, new upholstery, new carpet, you probably are in a dying church. If there's a book table, yeah? Growing churches have large book tables, small churches have small book tables, and dying churches have books on them that are yellow. And they've been looked through, and they have dog ears on them. You know if a church is living or dying by its book table oftentimes. Look at the the church bulletin or the newsletter that it puts out, is it for insiders or is it for outsiders? An insider, most of them are insider kinds of things. So you learn to read the existing churches and you make a picture of, are they healthy? Are they growing? And incidentally, a growing church is a church that is growing by 5% of conversion growth per year. Today, the first entry point for many people who want to look at a church is the website. And so that is also the gift of anonymity. They can look at the website and then decide, is this interesting enough? I met a woman who had come to Christ in one of our churches in Berlin, and she lived right across from where the church was and saw the sign of the church, looked the church up on the internet, and read all of the sermons that were posted on the internet. She read them all by the pastor, and that convinced her that she wanted to attend the church. Yeah, and she became a believer and is now involved in the leadership of this church. I remember before we even started with anything in Kaiserslautern, we had a website. And it was interesting to read the comments on the internet on our website. The most negative comments were from Lutheran pastors who were disgruntled that this free church pastor, this no-name, was starting a church in their city. And they said, he's got this fantastic internet presence. He doesn't have a physical presence yet, but he has a website. But we have 40 churches in the city. We can't get any kind of website among us generated. They were kind of disgruntled. Of course, prayer is the engine that drives all of this. Prayer will guide you. Prayer among the harvest, where you have your prayer meetings while you're walking through the city, walking through the region. If you're planting a church from a mother church, do not have your meetings, your church planting meetings in the mother church. Always in the place that you want to plant the church. And usually in a public place would be best. A cafe, a restaurant, a hotel, something that would get your heart beating faster because you're in that place, and then begin to pray for that. The assessment process, Martin mentioned it. Church planting generates lots of heat. People who want to plant churches, they're on fire, they're passionate, but unfortunately there's not a lot of light with the heat. And the assessment process is a way to convey light to people whose hearts are on fire. In Germany, we've been doing this for years, and we find the assessment process tells us about a third of our people have an unconditional recommendation to plant churches. They could start tomorrow. About a third of our people that we assess, we say, you have the aptitude, but there are some conditions that we would like for you to fulfill before you start. And then a third of the people, we would say, we believe that you have the gifts for an established church, and not so much a church planting ministry. You could shepherd, you could be a sponsor for church planting, and you should be doing that as an existing pastor, but you probably do not have the aptitude to be a leading church planting leader. And assessment surfaces the leader, actually, and not just the followers of the church planting. So a good assessment will act as a funnel to bring the people into church planting that need to be in there, and then it will act like a sieve to sort of sieve away from the church planting process those that do not belong. Decentralized locations for prayer and strategy. I was just looking at Martin's outline. I was thinking, I've heard this before. I need to flip over my own outline here. But we need to decentralize the locations for prayer and for strategy. That is, if we've divided up the region or the city in groups of 3, then we should be wanderers in terms of where we meet for strategy. We would meet in different thirds that we are trying to reach for prayer and strategy. We will try to create zone identity from the start. So what would be endemic to this third of the population? And we would begin to say, well, what identity will this church have by virtue of it being in this location? The leadership of the church plant is there to empower people who live in these sections to do ministry. It's the Ephesians 4 model. These people who are these gifts, and incidentally, this is the only passage in of the 4 gift passages where giftedness is connected with personage. So the gifts are the people who have these gifts, not just the aptitude. So these people are there to train others to do the work of the ministry. So the work of the team, the leadership team, is to empower people who live in these thirds to do the work of the ministry. They don't do it necessarily. They may do it, but use it as a training instance for the people that they're trying to empower. And then the participants who've proven themselves become the ministers or the servants and the leaders. In church planting, there is no provenness. There's no potential. There's only provenness. So where do you see possible potential, and how can you test people to see if they are proven in your estimation? Go from potential to provenness. What are some of the characteristics that you need? Generous prayer. When we started our last 3 churches, we did not start until we had 100 people on our Schindler's list that were committed to pray for us every day. And we feed them with prayer food every week. At the start, it was every week. So we had 100 people around the world that were getting prayer food and praying for us. And I think that was a real reason why in the last 2 or 3 situations we've seen significant growth. And in one situation, 60% of the church was conversion growth through our own church ministry. So generous prayer from others and from yourself. I remember I would invite people to breakfast at my home, and I would say, come early. Come 8 o'clock on Friday evening to have breakfast with us on Sunday morning. Because Friday night at 8 we begin an all-night prayer session, and we'll end it with breakfast. Now, I'll never forget, we had a guy there in the early stages of Mannheim. We were introducing ourselves. It was at 8 o'clock, and Ralph he says, "My name is Ralph." He looked at his watch, and I've been a Christian for 43 hours. But he was there in his all-night, prayer. It was wonderful. Times of fasting, times of total dependence upon the Lord. Fasting is not hungering; it's feasting on the presence of Jesus. Jesus, you are enough. The seminal passage in the New Testament on fasting is John 4, where Jesus is having a conversation while he is fasting with the woman at the well. And then his disciples come back from shopping, and they say, "Jesus, we brought you some food." And Jesus says, "I've already eaten." What he was doing is he was nourishing his soul in the presence of the Father while he was ministering to this woman. And he says, I've had enough, thank you. So generous prayer, emphasize small beginnings that have timed release attached to them. We talked about this. The smaller the sociological group, the quicker you need to do the timed release. You need to multiply these smaller entities. Share gift strengths all around. So if you look at, I'll do this here, if you look at meetings that you go to, you usually have an agenda, and the person leading the meeting sets up the agenda, and you go through these things. Over the years, I've realized that is not the best way to do a meeting. The agenda items need to be subservient to greater principles. And so I've developed 4 different areas that you need to address in a leadership meeting, be it a church planting situation or an established church. The first thing is everything that has to do with evangelism. The second thing is worker training. The third thing is leadership development. And the fourth thing is anything that has to do with organization or administration. So these are the priorities that you make your agenda items subservient to, which will show you, too, the holes in your ministry effectiveness. You should always address the church in its outward mode first. And that should have the greatest priority. And then raising up co-workers, leaders, co-workers, ministers, and then out of those, leaders. And then the fourth window is everything to do with organization and administration. But these things in this fourth window, they need to be delegated to a team of people who have the gift of organization and administration. The leadership team, the elder board or whatever, should not deal with this issue. In Germany, 50 to 70% of elders' meetings are consumed with organizational things, and it's a sin against the Lord, I think. They need to give these away to gifted people in the body that can do the things that they shouldn't do, so that they have the time to do these things. But if they were to do that, in many cases, they wouldn't know what to do. If they weren't doing administration stuff, they wouldn't know what to do, which is a problem in and of itself. But what's that? Okay, evangelism, workers, so raising up workers, and then leadership development, and then organization. Try this as your template for your next meetings, and you will find out. Or go. This is what I encourage existing leadership groups to do. Go through all of the minutes of the last year, and put the minutes in these four windows in terms of how much time did you spend on these issues, and it will be a revelation. It will be a revelation.
What's the difference between workers and leadership development?
Yeah, leaders lead workers. So there are three kinds of leaders in our churches: L1, L2, L3. This is rocket science now. L1 leaders are leaders who lead leaders. So the leader of your small group ministry who leads the small group leaders and their co-leaders is an L1 leader who leads leaders. Then the L2 are leaders who lead participants. The small group Bible study leader who has his 10 participants, he's the shepherd for these 10. And then the L3 are potential leaders. They are the people who are sitting in the second and third rows and who would never think to sit in the first row if you do not identify them. Let me give you an example. And if you are in Christian leadership, and you all are, one of your assignments is to be a scout. You need to scout out potential leaders and make them to be proven leaders. I became a Christian when I was 15. About a half a year later, a youth pastor came up to me in a large church and said to me, Diet, they called me Diet because they couldn't say Dietrich. He said, Diet, I want you to hold a devotional for other high school kids, about 30 of them, at 5:30 in the morning on a Wednesday morning before school. We meet for a devotional and prayer and breakfast. I said, great, but what is a devotional? I'd never heard that term before. And he told me what it was and how to prepare. And I did this thing called devotional. I did this devotional. Jesus as King. I still remember it from Mark 4, I think, or Mark 6. And afterwards, he came up to me, and an older woman from our church was very wise, and they both said the same thing to me, separately from one another. Namely, did you know that God has given you the gift of teaching? I said, great! But what is the gift of teaching? I knew nothing. But they saw something and awakened it and gave me opportunity to exercise it. And Those 2 minutes put me on a trajectory on which I'm still today. So if you're in leadership, what you need to do is scout out new leaders. And oftentimes you need to look at the teenagers and don't start with the 20-year-olds, but go down further. So you need to share gift strengths all around. I'm an organizational zero with the rims knocked off. I've often needed people around me that were great organizers, very conscientious people. I'm the big idea person, the visionary. I'll always be innovative in who I am, but I need people to mop up after me. I'm not good at mopping up after myself and channeling these things into structures. Celebrate collectively once a month. So you're doing this in the 3 areas that you've identified. So you're building up 3 separate entities, but once a month you need to draw them together for great celebrations, so that they are aware that they have a presence in the region that is greater than their section of the region or the city. Ralph Neighbor talks about this in terms of a bird. A bird flies because it has 2 wings that are functional. You have the sectional life going on, that's the one wing, and then the celebrative life, all told, that is the other wing. You need both. You need to set numerical targets in each zone. So targets, things that you have not reached, over and above what you've reached up to now. You need to set numerical targets in terms of how many more small group leaders do we need. Even trust God for numbers of people coming to Christ. Evaluate regularly. You need to evaluate how. You need to, every year, and probably more often than that, you need to ask yourself 3 things. What is working well? What needs to be improved? And what do we need to do that we've not yet done? And the last question will take you into the future. Is the new behavior. You need to grow financially, and you need to seek coaching. Somebody needs to come from the outside to coach you, to help you to become more effective. That's all I have to say right now. And take what I've said and pair it with what Martin has said, and you have what you need to start to think in terms of regional emphasis, not just in your one city, but think regionally the way that Paul thought. And if you are a regional leader, then you are an apostolic church planting leader. And the apostolic means that you have a greater vision than just one location. And you are a very rare bird and breed if you are that. And you need to begin to read the little bit of literature out there on apostolic church planting leaders. Reggie McNeil has written a book on apostolic leadership that I would commend to you. I've written some stuff on it, just a couple of articles. You could have that. But you need to, and then get with such leaders, learn from them.